Well, if it was meant to distract attention from a week of political chaos in Downing Street, it worked. Whether it will help end the deadly channel crossings is less clear. The scheme will see potentially tens of thousands of people who arrive on boats and lorries given a one-way ticket to Rwanda, a country in Africa which came to the world's attention with the genocide in 1994. It is intended to deter people desperate to get to the UK and also scupper the people smugglers who prey on them. Our political correspondent Liz Bates reports.
Good morning.
Having been on the defensive after breaking the law over the Downing Street parties, today the Prime Minister went on the attack. His target, illegal immigrants who could, under a new plan, get a one-way ticket to Rwanda.
Our compassion may be infinite, but our capacity to help people is not. We can't ask the British taxpayer to write a blank cheque to cover the costs of anyone who might want to come and live here.
Maybe with the local elections in mind, he leaned into language that has won him votes before, saying he would take back control of Britain's borders and criticising any lawyers who might get in his way.
We expect this will be challenged in the courts. And if this country is seen as a soft touch for illegal migration by some of our partners, it is precisely because we have such a formidable army of politically motivated lawyers who for years have made it their business to thwart removals and frustrate the government.
He also dismissed concerns over Rwanda's record on human rights.
Rwanda is one of the safest countries in the world, globally recognised for its record on welcoming and integrating migrants.
Under a new scheme, anyone that the government judges to have arrived illegally since the 1st of January could be immediately removed to Rwanda. If they qualify, they will be able to settle in Rwanda. They won't be able to return to the UK. The pilot will focus on single men arriving on boats and in lorries. Boris Johnson says this is all about ending those dangerous journeys across the Channel onto these shores. Just yesterday, 600 people came over in small boats. He says that in just a few weeks, that number could be as high as 1,000 a day. So alongside the tough talk on immigration, the Navy will take over patrolling these waters. There'll also be more money for more surveillance, all with the intention of bringing that number down to zero and ending the people trafficking for good. But the head of the Refugee Council says this won't stop desperate people taking to the seas in search of a better life.
It's a cruel, draconian policy that treats people, vulnerable people, people who have been victims of trafficking, of torture, as human cargo, sending them on planes across the world, thousands of miles, to another country that has a very dubious record when it comes to human rights. It won't deter people from crossing the Channel. It won't smash the model of people smugglers, the business model of people smugglers. It won't address any of the real reasons why people flee.
The Home Secretary was in Rwanda signing the deal today and handing over £120 million, the initial cost. But if the scheme is rolled out in full, the Refugee Council estimates that could rise to £1.4 billion a year. This drew criticism from within the Conservative ranks, with a former minister saying it would be cheaper to put people up at the Ritz, and a Conservative MP saying the plan was just a distraction from the Partygate scandal. Sentiments echoed by the Labour leader.
I think we need to see these plans for what they are. It's a desperate announcement by a Prime Minister who just wants to distract from his own law-breaking. They're unworkable, they're extortionate, they're going to cost taxpayers billions of pounds, and they just reflect a Prime Minister who's got no grit, no answers to the questions that need answering, and no shame. And I just think Britain deserves better than this.
But it's voters' opinions the Prime Minister really cares about. So what do the people of Hythe on the Kent coast think to the policy?
I don't think I agree with that. I think we should be looking after these people. I am quite scared for their lives coming over. I think they're in a lot of danger. I can't honestly say what I know they should do about it. I do worry about them. But yeah, Rwanda seems a bit of a strange choice.
Yeah, keep them away.
Do you think?
Yeah, keep them all away.
Do you think that could stop people coming if they would immediately just be taken to Rwanda?
It won't stop it fully, but it could be a start of it.
I think it'd be better if they was processed before they got here.
In France?
Yeah, and then it's quicker.
Yeah.
you know, that sort of thing. But I don't know about Rwanda.
You can definitely see what's happening.
And with more scrutiny to come when Parliament returns next week on this and on his role in the Downing Street party scandal, it could be a bumpy ride ahead for the Prime Minister.
Liz Bates there. Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, knows Rwanda well and joins us from the newsroom. Lindsay, the government say Rwanda is a perfect place to do this now. What do you think?
Well, it's not the earthly paradise that ministers seem to be suggesting today. In fact, it has a rather poor human rights record. President Paul Kagame, he was today visiting Jamaica. He's known as very ruthless, particularly against his opponents. Paul Rusesabagina, he was the hero of Hotel Rwanda, who saved many people during the genocide, but later opposed President Kagame. Well, he was kidnapped from Dubai, taken back to Rwanda, and faced what is widely seen as an unfair trial. President Kagame admitted that he tricked Rusesabagina into coming back. And Rwandans who have asylum here in the UK, on at least 3 occasions, they've had to have police protection because this government, the British government, says that the Rwandan government wants to kill them or maim them on British soil. I was talking to one of them today. He told me how he turned up at Dover 20 years ago on somebody else's passport, said he needed asylum. He got asylum. He said, what would they do with me now? Send me back to Rwanda for processing?
I mean, you can easily see what the UK government gets out of this, but what does Rwanda get out of it?
Well, it's a business deal. They get money. This is a very aid-dependent country. But they also get legitimacy and leverage. It becomes much harder for this government to criticise the Rwandan government if we need them. But, you know, I'm not really sure that this policy is going to work. Israel tried exactly the same a few years ago. They had a secret deal with Rwanda that they would ship refugees, asylum seekers from other African countries to Rwanda. And what happened was that nearly all of them, about 4,000, absconded. They just went north and east and came on those boats from Libya or Egypt into Europe. And if that is going to be prevented, well, what are they going to do? Are the Rwandans going to lock people up, just as they do with the opponents of Paul Kagame? It's very hard to see how this policy can work.
Lindsay, thanks very much. Well, earlier I spoke to the Conservative MP Tom Hunt, who heads the Home Affairs Policy Committee among backbench Conservative MPs. I began by asking him what he thought of the plans.
Well, you know, we've got to do something. That's clear. You know, we've seen the numbers spiral out of control. 28,000 last year. There's some thinking it can be towards 50,000 this year. You know, we've got to deter these crossings somehow.
The Home Office has said anyone who comes illegally is eligible for being sent to Rwanda. As you understand it, does that mean literally everyone? Women, families?
No, not everyone. I mean, they're still drawing up the criteria. And I think there's some sensitivity around that because they don't want vulnerable people to be potentially targeted by some of the smuggling gangs. But I think it's, you know, we know 70% of those who are arriving through this route are men under 40. And they'll certainly be eligible for it. And I think so will single women, but unaccompanied children won't. If they are fleeing persecution, it's important that they're safe and they're in a safe country.
But why can't they be safe here?
Why can't they be safe in France? You know, I think we can. And why can't? And actually, I've got every confidence they'll be safe in Rwanda as well. We want to deter these illegal crossings, and it is the humanitarian thing to do. We look at how dangerous these crossings are. We've had a number of people lose their lives in the Channel. We've got to deter these crossings. So, to be perfectly honest, I think under no circumstances is it acceptable to enter the UK through this route.
Why would the British government send people to a country which just last year it said it had real concerns about civil and political rights, and it was urging just last year the Rwandan government to investigate allegations of killings, deaths in custody and torture? Why would we do that?
Well, I understand. I've spoken to the one of the ministers in the Home Office today about it, and they said to me they believe that Rwanda has made significant progress over the last year or so. That is what they said to me. But it's also important to realise that the UN and the EU actually place refugees in Rwanda. You know, I've seen the accommodation which is in Rwanda, which looks perfectly adequate, and I think that there's. I think it's one of the fastest growing economies in Africa, and I think it actually has a fairly promising future as a country, I believe.
I mean, the closest similar offshore scheme that has been in place is the very, very controversial one in Australia. Just last year, an Australian expert on migration told a Common Select Committee that this sort of scheme did not work in Australia and wouldn't work anywhere else.
You say it was very, very controversial. Actually, the government that introduced that in Australia was re-elected multiple times after it did so. There was a significant amount of support in Australia for that policy.
People died, people took their own lives, people were murdered while being kept in the facilities there.
Australia had a significant problem with illegal immigration before it introduced offshore processing. It has much less of a problem today than it had back then.
Do you have no qualms at all? You don't feel at all queasy about the fact that we are sending an issue that we believe is a problem for us somewhere else?
What I feel queasy about is images of boats being capsized in the English Channel. What I feel queasy about are boats, some of which are incredibly not completely not seaworthy, travelling in one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. That is something I feel incredibly queasy about. And I think we've desperately got to get a grip on it.
And what about the fact that many, many people would say there are simply not enough safe legal routes?
We've taken 185,000, since 2015, which is a very large number. We're taking more now. We've got an uncapped scheme for Ukraine. This will put pressure on public services, but I still think it's the right thing to do. But when we have a parallel, irregular, illegal system putting additional pressure on, then I think it can quite quickly become unsustainable.
Tom Hunt, thank you very much for talking to us today.
No problem.
Well, joining me now is Alexander Downer, Australia's former foreign minister who looked after their border policies, and he's been reviewing immigration here. And Jacqueline McKenzie, an immigration lawyer. Jacqueline McKenzie, come to you first. Almost 50 people died last year crossing the Channel, more than 150 in the last 5 years. Something radical has to be done, and the government says this is it.
Yes, I mean, something radical does need to be done, but this is not necessarily it. What we really expect to see, we're a humane, compassionate society, is safe routes for people. And we've been talking to the government about this for a very long time. Safe visa routes, and even that's complicated because, there are theoretically safe visa routes for Ukrainians, and they're not getting in. So the whole thing really does need a massive overhaul. The important thing to look at is how many people are coming. There's about 30,000 a year. There are 4.4 million people seeking asylum across the globe. The UK really doesn't have a problem with numbers, and we need to get that across.
But, voters would tell you otherwise. And the problem is for you and people who support your view is that the government say the public are on their side on this.
Well, they might well be on their side, but it doesn't mean that they've got the facts. The facts are what they are. And the UK does not have a major problem. People will say, well, why don't they stay in France, for instance? Well, twice as many do. In fact, 3 times as many do. France pays £20 a week more in asylum support. It isn't true that people are coming here in huge numbers all for our benefits.
Alexander Downer, what do you make of this policy? Presumably you think it's a very good idea.
Well, I think it depends what you want to achieve, but ultimately if you want to stop people embarking on very dangerous journeys across the Channel, then you've got to destroy the business model of the people smugglers who are getting around £3,000 per person who gets on one of these rickety and they're often rubber boats. It's a highly dangerous activity to undertake. They're coming from France, so they're not being persecuted in France, and it makes sense to try to stop it. And the best way to stop it, we know from experience in Australia, is to demonstrate to the people smugglers that they can't deliver people to the destination that they're targeting. And in our case, that was Australia, in this case, the UK.
But when this was done in Australia, the United Nations begged Australia to stop doing it. It repeatedly said it was inhumane and incompatible with human rights. Does that not matter?
Well, some people in the United Nations had that view, that's true. No, it didn't matter because there's no perfect solution to this, but the alternative was to allow people to make these incredibly dangerous journeys. And in many cases, people died. Hundreds of people were killed or drowned and killed against the rocks of islands and so on their way to Australia. So, no, in the end, the Australian public had enough of it, and the Australian public said you should stop that.
But I suppose you're working on the basis that you're sorry, sir, but you're working then on the basis that, you know, if the conditions they're held in are inhumane, they suffer abuse, they're beaten, they take their own lives, that is the price they have to pay. Is that what you're saying?
Well, the way you phrase your question suggests that the Australian government is beating people and abusing them. Of course not. But, you know, there have been incidents, there's no doubt about that, and there's been a huge attempt by people, including the people who've been sent to Nauru. They're not exactly detained, but they're sent to Nauru and also to Papua New Guinea for processing. There's been a huge attempt by a small minority of them to try to break the back of the Australian system. But it's held up well. You know, you could correct me here, but I think in 2012 or 2013, Australia had something like 20,000 people coming to Australia on these tiny boats. And after this policy was introduced, that was reduced the following year to around 150, and the year beyond that almost zero. So what we've done is, and I mean, I know some people were inconvenienced by it, that's true, but the alternative is to allow people to come across. Well, they didn't like it.
I mean, the UN said it was inhumane and incompatible with their human rights.
It was not. Well, I visited Nauru and I visited the processing centre there, and it by no stretch of the imagination was remotely inhumane.
Okay.
And by the way, Australia, this won't come as a surprise to your viewers. Australia is not an inhumane country.
Okay, let me put that to Jacqueline McKenzie. The blunt truth is, it works.
Well, the UNHCR would disagree with that, and of course this gentleman has a vested interest in the Australian system. But these are not commodities, these are human beings. And in the UK, almost 75%, so when they arrive from the boats, almost 98% of them make an asylum application, and of those, over 70% succeed. We've today heard possibly as much as 75%. These are people seeking asylum who go on to be refugees. These are not illegal migrants, these are not economic migrants. Both the Home Office and the courts deem them to be refugees.
But the government are saying today, you heard Boris Johnson today say, we cannot ask the public to write a blank cheque for people who come here and may want to live here. Some may be asylum seekers, some may be economic migrants. And he says we have to distinguish between the two. And he says this new path to Rwanda is fairer on everybody.
Well, we have obligations in international law and in international treaty. That's the first thing. We're either, based on which measure you look at, the 5th, 6th or 7th richest nation in the world. We get 30,000 people. There are 80
many
million
people don't want uncontrolled immigration.
There are 80 million displaced people in the world. 26 million of them are refugees. 4.5 million are claiming asylum. Venezuela saw 4 million people leave in the last 2 years. 2 million of those have ended up in Colombia, a poor country. Poland has taken 2 million Ukrainians. We're talking about 30,000 people. It is unacceptable for us to be talking about them as though they're commodities that could be shipped across the globe to a country that does have an atrocious track record on human rights.
Alexander Downer, really, really quickly, the truth of the Australian policy was that it was not cheap. This cost billions and billions of pounds.
Well, so it would if people were allowed illegally to come to Australia. If you didn't have a proper immigration policy and allowed people just to swarm into the country without any controls, that too would be hugely expensive. We could afford it. And it destroyed the people smugglers' business model, and we stopped people undertaking really dangerous journeys.
People are still going to make the journey because they are genuinely fleeing persecution.
And by the way, they don't.
The journey.
Alexander Downer,
and they're not. And two things.
Jacqueline McKenzie, I'm going to have to stop you both there.
Indonesia.
Going to have to stop you both there, but thank you so much for talking to us.